Well, whatever the details of the agreement, one thing is already clear. Donald Trump arrives at the G7 summit with a diplomatic breakthrough that he says has ended a war that threatened to engulf the Middle East. Now, the conflict with Iran was never supposed to dominate this gathering until a few days ago. Leaders had expected to spend much of their time discussing Ukraine, trade, and the global economy. Instead, the deal with Tehran is likely to overshadow almost everything else. European leaders will be eager to learn what exactly has been agreed to, how durable it is, and what role they will play in the negotiations that follow. In the meantime, the German government is among those who have welcomed the deal. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz described it as a diplomatic breakthrough for President Trump. France and Britain are pushing plans for a multinational naval mission to safeguard shipping through the Strait of Hormuz once a ceasefire deal has taken effect. Here's the French president speaking on the sidelines of the G7.
We've built a mission with the British. We're in the region. There are several nations that are there: the Dutch, the Italians, the British, us. We're ready to act very quickly. To do what? Send planes, send a frigate, send minesweepers. And we also have our aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, with everything that surrounds it, which remains in the area and which can be deployed in the 2-3 days that will follow the confirmation. And therefore, what we're going to do with the Americans in parallel with the Iranians is ensure this deployment so this reopening of Hormuz can take place in a peaceful manner and that it lasts.
And joining me now is Kelly Grieco. She's a senior fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Kelly, it's good to see you again. This Iran deal, it certainly has transformed the mood going into this G7 summit. I mean, do you think, though, that G7 leaders, do they even know exactly what has been agreed to? We can't call it a peace plan. We can't call it a nuclear plan. What is it?
Yes, I mean, it's called a memorandum of understanding, which is essentially that there's some understanding around the terms of an agreement. But that, as you rightly note, we haven't seen actually the text of this agreement. We're probably not going to see that until Friday. Certainly, we hope that will be released publicly. Iranian media has provided some 14 points that they say are in the agreement, but coming out of the White House, at least, is some messaging that suggests there are some disagreements. So if the Europeans know what it is, they're certainly ahead of everyone else.
Well, we know that European leaders, they were frustrated by not being consulted before the United States went to war against Iran. Does this deal, does it repair that damage, or is there still a deeper trust issue that needs to be dealt with between Washington and its allies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is going to be an ongoing trust issue with Washington and its European allies, and not just because of the Iran war. I think it's because it's not a one-off in the lack of informing allies, working with allies closely, and going into this war. This administration is much more unilateral and doesn't necessarily consult allies and ask for their help and their support until after it's gotten into a situation like in the Strait of Hormuz, when it suddenly realizes it could use allied support. Yeah. And I'll just say, I think one of those areas where we're probably going to see some degree of tension potentially moving forward is around this UK-French proposal for joint patrols in the Strait of Hormuz. I think you'll see the president really pushing for that.
Is this an opportunity for Europe to play a meaningful security role here, or do you think it will ultimately be a spectator to anything that is negotiated moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that Europe, in some sense, will be a spectator to the negotiations themselves, it seems. And certainly, the signing of this agreement, Europe has not played a part. If there are, future nuclear negotiations, which it sounds like it will happen in the next 60 or 90 days with this, framework, it doesn't seem like there's really going to be a large role for Europe in that. What I think is interesting is there is an opportunity here, as you suggest, for Europe to show its strategic importance by providing potentially this joint patrol mission in the Strait of Hormuz. But I think there are two, significant complicating factors here. One is that Iran has signaled that they don't want any Western navies to be involved in the Strait of Hormuz and have this patrol mission. So there may be real opposition coming from the Iranians. And then the second piece would be, under what circumstances, strategic environment, are the Europeans going to be comfortable providing this kind of patrol. They've been clear, Britain and France, that they were not comfortable doing this when it was still an active war zone. What level of peace and stability would they require in order to be willing to conduct this kind of mission?
This deal reportedly includes sanctions relief and economic incentives for Iran. European countries, they supported a similar approach during the Obama years. Does this feel like a return to a strategy that Europe has been advocating all along?
I find myself as an analyst wanting to say, yes, the truth is that it is. But the other part of me that thinks that we're better off, with an agreement almost doesn't want to remind the current administration of that reality because they're likely to, pull back, right? If they're reminded of that, if they're facing all these comparisons to, the Obama era, they're likely to push back hard and see this as an embarrassment. And so that is the reality, is that this is very similar in many respects to what Europeans have advocated for, certainly for diplomacy. And it'll be interesting to see how this is handled, I think, at upcoming meetings of the G7, because if the president feels like he's not being respected, that others are seeing him as, losing the Iran war, which is effectively the truth.
Yeah.
If he has that, he could become much more volatile and unpredictable in how he handles things.
I'm just trying to imagine what it's going to be like when they're all sitting at one table for this summit. Do you think we're going to see fundamentally different interpretations of what happened in Iran when they're all together and, doing their G7 discussions?
Yes, I think you might see very different interpretations, too, of what they're saying to Donald Trump in these meetings and how they may present it to the president himself, president of the United States, and, sort of appealing to his, ego and things like that, because they understand this individual quite well at this point. And then what they're privately thinking and what they're saying, even to their own publics. I think you'll see some split in that messaging for sure. It seems like this G7, just the way it's been designed by the French, is trying to be very careful to try to avoid issues that might cause conflict with the Trump administration. Climate change is not on the agenda. There's this lovely dinner that's supposed to happen at Versailles on Wednesday because they know the president loves, Versailles, and he loves gold. So they're carefully managing the agenda to try to sustain his attention and engagement. And I think they're going to try to do that even on some of these tough issues like the Iran war.
Yeah, there were big topics before the Iran war. Let me take us back in time a little bit. Before this crisis, Ukraine was expected to dominate this summit. Has it now been pushed down the agenda? More on the back burner?
I think that's one of the real consequences of the Iran war overall, is that it clearly has pushed Ukraine on the back burner. Here, at least in D.C., we're not really talking, as much about the peace process involving Ukraine and the opportunities for a ceasefire there. All of the oxygen has really been absorbed by the Iran war. And I think you can see that even the signing of this, memorandum right as the president's leaving, of course, the Iran war is going to be the focus, and the economic fallout has been significant, including for Europe. Ukraine is expected to attend, and it will be on the agenda, but it does feel as though it's been bumped down to at least the number 2 issue.
The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, he is arriving with some momentum after slowing Russian advances, but he still needs military and financial support. Is there a risk that Western attention is simply running out? Is he really now also fighting against the clock, not just against the Russians?
Yes, I think to some extent that's always been true. He experienced this probably first, you could say, with the United States and American intention and willingness to provide, financial and military support. And Europe, being closer to Ukraine itself, was willing to take on and extend that for longer. But ultimately, European interests, particularly Western European interests and Ukrainian interests, are different. And I think just to be fair to many of these Western European countries, they're thinking about how do we rebuild and grow our own militaries and strengthen them. And that is harder the longer you're providing very substantial military support to Ukraine itself, because you're not able to build up as much your own capabilities. And so these trade-offs, the longer the war goes on, become more acute. And I think there's a growing sense that perhaps Ukraine should take the momentum of this moment where it's doing better on the battlefield to try to get more favorable terms for some kind of agreement And I think it's important, I'll just say, that the Europeans seem to be more open to that idea than they were early in the Trump administration, because I think that puts some pressure on Kyiv itself to look more seriously at some of these options.
I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like you're saying that Ukraine needs to make hay while the sun is shining, and the sun is shining right now and will stop shining soon. I mean, is that what you're saying? That if they can get promises of help, if they can get more military aid, now is the time to secure that?
It is. I mean, I think in some sense, in order to do that, because the Russians will be looking for signs that there's going to be more military aid coming, right? Because they're doing these calculations as well. But I would just say that we want to avoid a repeat of the moment before, the big 2023 offensive, where it felt like Iran, Ukraine had the momentum on the battlefield, and then it tried to go further than probably its military capabilities allowed. And the momentum just really shifted back to Russia at that point. I would like to see that Ukraine not repeat that mistake of the past and actually use this period of momentum to try to strengthen its position for a diplomatic process rather than trying to pursue full military victory.
And U.S. President Trump, he appears focused on wrapping up the Iran conflict. There was a time when he said that he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, and he hasn't been able to do that. Is the fact that Iran has been so difficult and yet has produced some result, is that a positive or a negative for Ukraine?
Wow. I think if you were looking at Ukraine, you were looking at the deal Donald Trump got against Iran, that probably should give you reasons to be concerned. If you effectively look at this deal, it's essentially an attempt as much as possible to go back to the pre-war status quo. This deal otherwise is quite favorable to the Iranians. So I would say that it may make you question, the effectiveness of his, negotiating skills, if you will.
Yeah.
But I think what it would really do is it's leave, Ukraine really has to think about, the president doesn't have a long attention span, and he's clearly been focused on the Middle East war. And it's not clear that even if this war, if it truly does end, and that still remains an open question, if his focus will even come back to Europe and to the Ukraine issue, or if he really feels like he's passed that off to Europe and that's Europe's to deal with. I suspect it's the latter.
Kelly Grieco, as always, Kelly, good to get your insights on this. We appreciate your time. Thank you.